Today's chat is with two of my favorite people in the world. It's Woody and Steina Vasulka. I first got to know them through their interaction with Noisefold, which is David Stout and Cory Metcalf. As part of their work and they're pulling me in to see their community, I got a chance to meet the Vasulkas, who have an incredible history. So what I did was at a recent workshop series in Seattle, they happened to be there as part of a project, and so I kind of cornered them in their hotel room and got a chance to ask them about their history and about what makes them tick. Now, two issues. First of all, it's a very long interview, so what I've decided to do based on listener feedback is I'm actually going to be breaking this up into two parts. The first part will post on Sunday, and the second part will post on Wednesday. That way it gets broken up a little bit, and I get a little more time to do my editing work, so that's what we're going to do with this one. The second thing is, unfortunately, I had two recorders running for this. I had my trusty Tascam and my laptop as kind of a backup. Well, luckily for me, that backup was good because my Tascam hand recorder just did not do its job yet again. Not having a lot of fun with that thing right now. So what you're hearing is the audio that was recorded by the laptop that was kind of sitting in between us all, but unfortunately, as you can imagine, laptop audio is not quite as good as we'd hoped for. So there's the explanation for the audio quality. I apologize, but what they have to say and what they have to share is so important. I felt like we needed to put this up anyway. So with that, I offer you Woody and Steina Vasulka.
Can you tell me a little bit about your background and how it's influenced your art?
Yeah, but you see, my tragedy is this. I have to go really to the war again.
Right.
And then I have to go through kind of first even the occupation. See, when we were invited by the Germans as the first step, like expansion to the east, because they planned already that they're gonna conquer the Russia. You know, the Hitler dream was. So then they needed the Czech industry to produce material, airplanes, which they didn't trust the Bohemians, so they went to the Slovakia and made a deal with the Slovaks as being liaisons and being friendly, and then they made all the production of the airplanes there, because they were afraid that the Czechs would, booby trap it.
Right, sure.
So it was clear. But they let the Czechs do mostly the huge cannons. See, they made these unbelievable cannons that Hitler then put on, when they expected the American invasion. And they actually killed Americans and airplanes and also ships. And the Czechs kind of were guilty because they produced that very well and it all worked, and they were scared not to produce well. So
right.
The airplane just disappears and nobody knows why they crashed, they were shot or not. So this kind of ambiguity was clear. I will learn that a little bit further after the events. I was kids, too young to actually understand it during that process. But as soon as the Germans first went all the way there, into Russia, but then they get beaten back, then was clear it was kind of a place for the maturity of understanding this political game. My father, of course, worked for the company that produced light weapons and also gave it to the for the Nazi military. And but as I say, we were not brutalized except the Jews living there and the Gypsies. They were taken as the same into these places and they were trying to eradicate them, but then the whole idea about who actually Hitler was somehow mysterious, because we Czechs look at them as total idiots, but the Americans, I mean the Germans took him as a serious person that would kind of totally eradicate something called, the unemployment and, all the suffering of that past. When he came, he made the nation dynamic, and he gave them ideology, and they were sort of stupid enough to accept it, which was very puzzling to the Czechs, because Czechs are so doubtful, and so. But I didn't feel that we were sort of completely flagellated, or that they wanted to erase us, because we were good workers. My father was a secret communist because he came from the Russia. Was number of the first war, military, and then he caught that kind of socialism or communism there, and then but he was very quiet during that war. There was no communist party that would be visible, and so the guys were working and making all the materials for the Nazis, which later I was actually quite upset about it, because the Czechs helped the German Wehrmacht to function, and that was. But then, of course, it was clear, and we were forgiven by everybody, and then we were slight communists there, and we had a socialism, and so forth. So it was the beginning. But I was lucky to catch my friends, and our friends were a couple of them older, and they went all the way to the decadent part of the French. The French in about at the middle of the previous century. There was this period when there was this sort of strange, was this people like. Let me try to remember names, but who were the poets of that time that were decadent in France?
Yevtushenko.
What?
Yevtushenko.
No, this is Russia. No, we are talking now about France.
Oh yeah, Rimbaud.
Rimbaud.
Baudelaire.
Yeah, Baudelaire. And that group of at least 5 or 6, just a real decadent, and Rimbaud, was a kid, and all kind of stuff that was so perverted. Also, a lot of sexuality there between them, and so that was the first time when we were taken from the Czech, more or less moderate and sweet and a lyrical thing to a radical moment, and the radical moment had some impact on us to accept modernism in an extreme, because the modernism was in some kind of a perverted, version of the traditional poetry of the Czech poetry, which was usually sweet and was interesting, sometimes radical, but it never crossed in this sexuality, freedom of sexuality. And so for us, this was all open. And then, of course, there was part of the Russia, early Russia, which was, what was that guy again you said?
Yevtushenko.
Yeah, and that was later. But the guy that grew up with Stalin, back in the Stalin's name, Zhugashvili, he was the Oriental man, and the guy that was a poet, that was my favorite poet. But anyway, this all came together and made right for us, when I started to be aware of that, when I was at the age probably of 17, we had a jazz band in my hometown. We practiced this kind of learning poetry of that period, this decadent poetry. We had our own theaters in the outside of the city. We went to the hills and did all kind of interesting things. There was some nudity, but no penetrations. So it was very free world, and we were sort of left. On the other hand, not the communist left, because it became slightly perverted into complete brutality.
Right.
So, but we were still left. There was no doubt. And and in that situation, we practiced all kind of a format. We may have a jazz band, and it was a bebop. It was a station in Vienna called Blue Danube. It was the military station. They were just, of course, occupying that. But there was a guy called Willy Canover, and we had this what's called special language, special English, when he was using a limited amount of vocabulary, but we could learn that after hearing it for 5-10 times, and then it was jazz and bebop and all these contemporary new,
But did you know then that you were artist?
That he was what?
That you were artist?
I was curious about the same thing, because to a certain extent, I'm not sure that when you're 17 and you're playing music and you're listening to music and you're running around with your friends and you're experimenting with sexuality, is that just being young, or is that becoming an artist?
I did my major entrance to what I call cultural art was the poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And I still, with me and my consciousness, the poetry is the most supreme form, because it's the most abstract. Once you go into prose, then you have to lie, you have to talk about people that you don't know, you have to invent people, you have no freedom. You have to model the world. And and that is eventually become imprisoning you, especially when I kind of went through my not little, but serious industrial post school after my general school. I realized that I have to leave this kind of idea of reality as far as technology, and then the poetry was the only escape I had, and also to write prose, I eventually have to pick it up somewhere, and it was no longer mine. See, so the poetry is the only private, really sort of fantasy. You don't pretend anything. You allow it to be extraterrestrial, if you want. I didn't know that term before, but it's something that you are not obliged to respect. And it comes also from the French, and also before the French, there were these weirdos, alcoholics and all.
Right.
And so that freedom, I had to sort of, in my school, film school, which was my next school, kind of, first I had to obey the rules of film, which is always something that is protecting to be real, at least in that school.
Right.
And you could not just go and be out. But that's eventually collapsed. You see, I did some mostly documentary, because we were taught first documentary, and then all the process of editing, how you cut things and you had to be narrative,
Right.
and you make before, then, and after. So it had to be absolutely, sort of logical, And even if you were cuckoo, you had to just give that function to a person, mostly actor, So it's a kind of a different bag. Some people like it. Some people are masters of it. Some people are very good at that. But when I was facing going to Hollywood, when I met Steina there, and she was playing, still learning violin or practicing violin there, and I asked her, could you take me out? Because I was at the end of, my education there, and I said, I'm not gonna go to make films,
Right.
I just cannot do it. And she said, oh, sure. So we got married, and she took me to Iceland. And it was very clear that from Iceland, and she's got an uncle in Pennsylvania, and then that's how we ended first, and then that's where I get my first English a little bit, and then she took me to big town, to, where was that called? Yeah, this was New York City.
Yeah.
And first we were in the student environment, but I got a good lecture from this Jewish young kid that taught us dramatically, drastically English, and we were all these weird people from Orient and all, and so he beat us into pay. But after, half a year, I could go downtown and we got some places to live, and just got really next to Andy Warhol, crowd there, down, lower. And then I was supposed to go to Hollywood with my friends that came from...
That's kind of a fiction. You would never have gone to Hollywood.
Yeah, I don't know, but I realized I got very frightened to be something else. I got some interesting jobs around. I was freedom enough I could still do work on my own and work for a group of people that did special jobs, and I learned a lot there. But then eventually it was clear to me that I stumbled over electronic images in acoustics, in the sort of what's called what do you call in English? It's the, it's synthesizers, and our first synthesizer we got was Putney, you probably remember that.
Right.
And and then of course that time we just stumbled over, kind of electronic pictures. We had of course monitor, and then plug this all sort of in, and bang, and I understood there was a horizontal and vertical, frequency, and then once you put it together, they actually make you a picture, and you make all these, square and, all kind of pictures and so. And then we realized that we are not alone. There's a whole community already in the States. This is later, 40s,
60s.
60s.
60s. Neither 40s nor 80s, it's 60s.
Oh, 60s,
Right.
right.
60s.
Yeah. And so we suddenly understood, wait a minute, we are not alone, but we are in the first generation of the kind of the things that would record, what the half-inch, format,
The Portapack.
Portapack, yeah. And
But
then we...
I see your life slightly different. You weren't really an artist. I mean, you would never have described yourself an artist. nor would I actually, or maybe somewhat more, because I didn't have any other relationship to the planet. But when we started in video, it never occurred to us that we should do what other people do with the portables. You know, we started right away going from feedback. We consider it art.
Yeah, but we were both that time musicians, remember?
Yeah, but we weren't what is called artist, and actually the way the Americans call artist is can do anybody and everybody, where it's some kind of an honor bestowed on you in Europe.
Yeah.
But it is obvious from the first time we did video, we did it in things that in America would only be described as art.
But look at it this way. That time, I was associated, remember, in that film group with these avant-gardists, you know, both guys, the Czech, what was his name?
Sasha Hamid?
No, Hamid and Sasha Hamid and the other
Francis Thompson.
Yeah, they used to be avant-garde in film in the United States, you know.
Yeah.
He hadn't to be a Czech, but he was working with the other guy. That name still should be known because they were really originally radical individuals that would also touch the social consciousness. But then, of course, when I met them, they were only producing, you know, for the big shows. See, like, and I ended with cutting, you know, 70 millimeter. What is it called? Film. And but then I said, hell, I mean, this is not what I want to do. So anyway, that time actually the decision about taking things as electronic image was clear suddenly, because there was this tool and you could go on the street with it. We still use it as a record, remember, both of us, because there was no editing as such, you know, it was just the splicing of ugly things. So, and then of course, then we find the material through the acoustics. And then we started to combine it and create visual products.
Yeah, but we felt it was kind of, because we were highly aware of people like, say, Stockhausen and Barres, and we knew that was going on. And
we were highly cultured because we brought also a piece of Europe with us.
Yeah, and then we immediately understood that this was the visual end to it. It was just the same thing as the electronic music, but in visuals.
Yeah, but
we didn't have the problem there.
But the decision that we don't have to, that I don't have to go to Hollywood, was so relieving. I was so high, because now I have my material, even if it was totally, you know, primitive. It was
yours.
It was just exciting. Then I knew the future immediately. I projected and I said, oh, when it gets the technological embrace, it will be just my future. I knew that. Anyway, that was
well. So that's fantastic. And the thing that I'm that's really interesting, and I don't think in talking with you before, have you ever gone into such detail about sort of the feelings surrounding the war being such an influence to you?
Okay, so that's a very special thought. Let's say, see, I was by accident born across the airfield from the first war. That was suddenly they built, you know, military built. This is the outskirts of the place I was born, called Brno, or Brünn in German, and so it was just in front of us, but we were a little bit outside, and there was an airfield. So since I was a kid, very young, I was always looking at that place, because this for me that it was a magic, you know. Things came out of the ground and they flew. And then first I thought it flew because the the wings were this way, that they would be
They were pointing up,
going forward, and by the speed of the going forward would be elevated. Of course, later I learned that it has to have a special
The curve.
thing in the bottom of the wing in order to lift the thing. Then the first time I understood that the world is not simple. It's not a linear thing.
Right.
And that time I was maybe 5 years, 6 years old. And so now when the fight came through our village, when the Nazis went to Russia and they were almost making it, but then they were beaten back, and that was very fast when the Russians just got back. So at the age of 7 or what, which is going through the place, where I fought. And then, of course, we ran away to the countryside for a while to get a sort of a less fight we were expecting. My family was expecting that there would be a fight in that airfield and all that stuff. So, but in fact, it was much worse there in the countryside. But I saw the whole thing there, people actually shooting each other, Russian and they. So, as a kid, I always look out the window and say, "Fuck, what did I see?" So it was an interesting kind of observation. But by the time I was fed by a lot of films, first from the Nazi system. We all kids had to go to these movies, and Hitler had 2 big productions, and they were talking about the East Front records and West Front record, because the Americans also were coming into it. And we kids were so knowledgeable about every detail, because there was one movie in the middle of the week and the other movie was at the end of the week. And that was produced by this Nazi propaganda, but they had to admit that the other armies are coming.
Yeah, right.
There was no way to hide it anymore. So then it was our education. Then we got books from the, again, from the propaganda of the Germans. It was very, very, very strict and truthful, because Germans, they were very profoundly, detailed. And we get books about the airplanes, all the names, speed, guns, and then there was something about boats, and the whole idea about and about tanks and cannons. So we got these books, and we quiz each other, guys, kids, in the game. So how many cannons is this machine? And some guys knew everything, and I was good, but then some of them didn't know shit. So we had total control over the Nazi apparatus. But we were so glad. First we played a game between Russians and Germans, so we switched it so not to be intimidated. But then when the Germans started to lose, we didn't want to be the Germans, so we played the cowboys and the Indians. So that was a solution of this beginning. Stupid, like Germans. You couldn't play with German anymore. So, and that was basically the education of the war for us. And then there was already something like from London. That was a broadcast. And then you had to bring your sort of radio to the special place, and they would, rip up some certain wavelengths, from the radio. But then themselves, the Nazis listened to it because they didn't believe anymore in the propaganda. See, but then there were these guys next door. We lived in this kind of a larger kind of village, like outside of the city. And then they would come back to us, these friends, and they put it back, when the rest the Germans took out.
Sure.
So we were listening, but you could get really into jail or in concentration camp if they would catch you. But since they listened themselves, eventually they would come and look for the houses if there are weapons and on, and so you had to hide these pieces of material somewhere, this sort of things, So it was very risky, but I only have heard one case when the people were really punished for having this listening to the radio. There was a radio something, the name from it, for London. So we got very much an understanding what was in the whole front. And so then we knew Germans were not gonna make it. So we just such a freedom coming. So, and then we were waiting for the takeover by the Russians, which it all happened. It was not very dramatic, except you could see, from the windows, and also when we were in the countryside, and and then there comes the Russians and ask, where are the Germans? And some idiot says, oh, they're far, they only run. And something, oh, and then you hear a little shooting, and then they got the guy that my buddies, like the older guys, sent him there to death. It was very bad, So, but we have seen this like a theater, That time I was probably about 10 years old, and but then we started to collect all the weapons that were left. But they were asked to bring them to a special place in the village, in a pile. But at night we came and took the best weapons. And then we made a whole trade with the weapons. And so it goes on and on. There's a tremendous amount of events after that. Of course, kids, this was the hilarious time. It's elevating, we were free, and the Russians were okay, they were just drinking. Occasionally they tried to rape a woman, but they got shot by the officers, they're not supposed to do it. So they kept it somehow together, this Russian high. And that's how the whole things exploded. And that's what I'm saying about the culture that followed. That was, I became slightly adult, at school we got general education, and with friends we made groups that were completely independent because we didn't want to be part of anything, and we had our own culture, music, jazz, and went to theaters, and so we had a very part of a wonderful 3 years of independence.
Sure. It seems to me like your background would be very much different because you're from Iceland, which I don't think really got dragged into the war at all.
They were not occupied only by the British and Americans. So that was solved.
Yeah, I used to hang on my fence on my house because the American soldiers, they had their headquarters or living quarters at the end of the street where I lived. And we would hang out there and ask them to give us chocolate, which they loved to do. And when my mother found out, she absolutely forbade us, and then we had to sneak out there. And that's my first time I realized that I always like to sneak, break rules and sneak out and not do as I'm told to. That's kind of the first memory of doing that. But that has been my whole life. I just like to lie and not viciously, but just to not tell truth, because truth is rather boring. And when I tell people, people are usually shocked by it. And except artists, I often, with artists, they look at me in great sympathy and say, me too, you know. Maybe that's the real difference between artists and other people.
Their enjoyment of lying.
Yeah, or basically cheating, not telling the truth. And fiction, dictation, this kind of things. But anyhow, that was my experience of the war. I remember the D-Day because we went down to the main square and the American soldiers came in and did double somersaults and all kinds of things. It was just an outburst of joy that was enormous. And I've been like 4 years old then, or 5.
Wow.
But I remember that. But I lived kind of in a fabulous fictional world as a child, as an early child. And it never bothered me. I had siblings and whole family that was very intellectual and very smart and did well in school and everything. I did none of those things. And I wonder why it didn't bother me, why I didn't sit down and cry and say, I'm stupid, I can't do those things. But my idea was just to not go to school. So I have very little schooling in my life. And I got sick, and that made it easy to just get a paper from the doctor that I couldn't go to school.
Right.
And when my mother didn't want to produce this paper anymore, go to the doctor, I just went myself. He was on the main street in town, up on 5th floor. It was an elevator. It was very exciting to ride up the elevator into his office and say, I don't want to go to school. And he was a country kid, educated in one schoolroom. He knew exactly what I didn't need that for, and always gave me a paper, so I didn't go to school. I went for the exams in the spring, so I was always officially in the next step, but again, not going there.
But you never actually attended?
Huh?
You never attended?
Not much.
Oh.
And then I got later into, like, when we were high school, into taking the classes I wanted to take and not the others. I went to girls' school, and we were supposed to learn embroidery and knitting and sewing and cooking, ironing, and I explained I wasn't interested in that and just skipped it, but I liked geography and mathematics, and so I went to those classes. And for me this was normal. I thought everybody should do this. I had no idea until later that I have never met anybody else who did schooling that way. But I thought that it was just a rational, right way to do. But then I became obsessed with education. I actually consider myself fairly educated, unschooled but educated, because I went through this obsession of I had to know as much as the people who knew. So I went to history books and I started comparing Napoleon is born before Beethoven because Beethoven wrote a symphony on Napoleon, and then when Napoleon traded the world by crowning himself, Beethoven changed it into Eroica Symphony, which was his 3rd symphony. So I made my own kind of explanation of how things happen, because I don't think that's how history is taught officially.
Right.
And you also realize with history, that it is basically traced through art, only through art and victories on the battlefield. And that's the history we get down. So to combine them like that was a great deal of fun.
Sure.
And eventually I was learning this violin and I was getting nowhere, which was partially that I had been sick and I didn't have much physicality for anything. I got tired of playing after 15 minutes. So I wasn't making much progress on the violin, but it was the only thing I liked to do was music. And I would go to every concert that was given in my hometown, and also went to a lot of lectures, and I always got in for free because eventually all the guys who took tickets, they knew me, and they just showed me through.
Right.
You know? And I would find a seat or sit on the steps or something, and attend things like that. And I had time because I wasn't going to school, so I could go to all things. And then there was a grant to go to Czech Republic, and that's Czechoslovakia, because we were friendly, and we were maybe the most friendly country in West Europe to East Europe. But it wasn't very friendly. The whole Cold War was so frightening, and so when the Czechs offered to take a music student, I was the only applicant. So I got there not because I knew how to play the violin, but because there was
the only
nobody
one
else.
not scared, huh?
They were also scared.
Wow.
But the end of that story is very nice because I was the first one to go who was not sent there by the Communist Party. I was there as a cultural student. And after me, everybody started going. There's a whole load of Icelanders who have been educated in Prague. It just needed somebody to break the wall. And,
Sure.
yeah, and it was a very good education, and it was absolutely for free, and which included meals and board and everything. So
And you were specifically studying violin?
I was, yeah, and it was the same pattern. They were offering, of course, well, it was obligatory. You had to learn Marx-Lenin theory, was that what it's called?
Sure.
And I never would go there. And I, of course, always told them I didn't understand the language. And that was tolerated. But it only took me a year, and then I understood the language, but never let them know, anybody in the school. So I was a fanatic about art. I knew art was the only thing that counted. But I wasn't sure where I was in that, if I had a role as an artist, because I figured out I could eventually maybe play second violin in some low-paying orchestra or something and have enough to live, that I wouldn't die, and that I could use the rest of the time to study and to live. And it's interesting because then when we came to New York, everybody thought that way. Everybody was trying to get minimum amount of money, somehow do some odd jobs, waitressing or whatever, just so that they wouldn't die, but not enough to really live. And it was we fell into a whole society of people who thought that way to try to get away with it, you know. It was never any talk about earning money in our group. It was downtown, which is where what later was called Soho.
Right. Now, was that the desire not to get much money? Was it to try and avoid obligation, or just to see if you could get away with it?
Get away with it. See, we were all obsessed with doing our thing, as it was called.
Right.
And but there is this idea about money. It needs to be there just so that you can pay a rent and pay some food. And both of these were extraordinarily cheap in the 60s in New York. I remember we got ourselves a loft, $425, and everybody was scolding us. Nobody pays over $100 for a loft. You know? And it was a huge loft. It was great.
So the two of you, well, before we get into it, Woody's story has a lot of relationship with war and fear. You seem to have a different relationship, which is kind of like skirting through your childhood, doing kind of as you wish. and finding a way to study things that you were obsessed with. At some point, you made decisions that caused you to get serious about your instrument and eventually to move to New York. What were the things that caused? What were the events that caused you to make those changes?
See, Woody asked me to liberate him from Czech. It was a very oppressive.
So, did you meet him while you were there studying?
Yeah, I met him while I was
Okay.
studying.
Okay.
And I
know.
dragged him out of that country. And then came the question, where are we going to go? Because obviously Woody wants to go to Iceland and to live there as a happy Icelander ever after. And I hadn't done the States. I had done Europe. I lived for a while in Germany and Denmark and here and there. So it was obvious that we would come to the States. But we came just as a tourist or as people. We weren't going to emigrate.
Right.
Immigrate. There was never any agenda. And we wouldn't have if the person who did our immigration papers, we had to show up every 3 months and get an extension of the visa.
Right.
And she said, I can't give you any more extension. You had enough. And we would say, okay, we'll leave. And she said, don't leave, get a lawyer. It was amazing. We had never thought that we should get a lawyer. So then we had a green card. And because when you have a green card, you tend to stay.
Right. So this puts you all in New York, which is kind of the point at which history books normally pick up your narrative, which is that you are part of this kind of underground artist world that starts doing things, doing kind of radical things, right?
Yeah.
Who are the instigators from your perspective?
See, Woody, of course, was working in a place that he persuaded them to have video. And the reason he persuaded them is that he had gotten weather of this video as art, actually, mostly through an exhibit in Howard Weiss Gallery of people who then became our colleagues. But there were all kinds of things going on there. There was something called Automation House, and it was totally dedicated to electronic arts. And this is actually before we started ourselves. So it was kind of in the air. It was just the environment. It wasn't particular. We knew about Nam June. I had actually heard about him operating in Europe, sort of in the mid-60s. He came to Iceland and had a scandal, and so on and so forth. So we were just there. But what is interesting is, as soon as we decided to do video, we had to learn English. We had to start talking to each other in English because we didn't know any electronic terms in Czech.
Sure.
And we started communicating with the English-speaking people, so-called Americans in New York. And we started dropping off our European friends. It was like a feast of fun and parties and things. From the time we arrived until we started in video, we just lived and partied and were around. And they were kind of very frustrated that we just one day disappeared from the radar. We would be English speaking and doing American type art and schmoozing with different people.
No, we just interfere a little bit in a different trajectory.
Sure.
Because when I look what happened to me to sit here now, for example, how did I ever end it in this? Because it's so rational now when I look at it, but that means I have to admit I have no idea how to act, but I must have been opportunist or advised by something that I still don't understand what. Let's say, look at it this way, that when I went through my beginnings, and the war, of course, was essential, and just to give you some kind of more hands-on situation, living across to, this airplane situation, these young Nazi pilots would, fly every 3 months after education, training in the school, and they get a free ride. They just are supposed to fly.
Mm-hmm.
Now, from this, 14 or 16 guys, one usually crashed, 2, and we as kids were waiting because we knew they were coming up, and we were just concentrating, watching it. And then there was this hill just before, the thing, they would go down, and that was the place when about 3 in that half a year crashed. And then we were waiting for that opportunity, because we could be there right after the guys, their bunch of German doctors and soldiers and everything would run there. They pick up the boys, took their pieces of the boys, took some of the weapons, and just went. They didn't have interest anything about it. And the boys were behind the corner. We just went there and we completely took these airplanes apart. It was difficult, and we always find this secret. There's always secret in the wing for the emergency. There was a gun. There was, something for sleeping, and we got some money. And the guys didn't want to touch it. They just didn't want to open it. But we did. So because we did good stuff, and then we hand it and exchange it and so on. So it was the first time that I understood that, how this whole system is working. We put also parts of the engines that we could carry,
Mm-hmm.
and we took them home, and then we worked on them, So this was my first kind of touch with this high quality material, and Nazi at that time was very much advanced. And my father had a workshop downstairs in the house, so I just spent hours taking apart and studying it. So that's how I got the bug. You see, I get the bug.
The bug for gear.
I'm still doing it. It's still here. The same bug is still there. So this was it that brought me to this technological dependence. So I'm still very much part of the same initiation.
Okay, so there you go. That's the first half of the interview with the Vasulkas. The second half is going to drop on Wednesday, where they talk about Buffalo, Santa Fe, and we even have a little dish on Terry Gross from NPR, so go figure. With that, thanks a lot for listening, and I'll see you again on Wednesday for part 2. Thanks.